A mind that could reshape thought itself arrived in a galaxy where empires are built not on armies, but on fear buried so deep it becomes belief. The Force had ruled this war for millennia, light against dark, destiny carved in prophecy. But Charles Xavier brought something the Emperor never anticipated: the power to reach past conditioning and armor into the place where a stormtrooper still remembers his name, where an interrogator feels the weight of every broken prisoner, where obedience cracks and conscience wakes like a flame in absolute darkness. In a regime that controls billions by making them forget they ever had a choice, what happens when one man reminds them they still do? The twin suns of Tatooine had burned over sand and stone for millennia, their light carving shadows into wind-sculpted ridges that stretched toward horizons where sky and desert became indistinguishable. In the year following the Battle of Yavin, when the Death Star's destruction still echoed through Imperial command channels and rebel cells multiplied in the outer rim like stars igniting in the void, the desert world remained as it had always been, a place where the galaxy's troubles arrived late and left slowly, filtered through layers of heat and indifference. Moisture farmers tended their vaporators beneath those relentless suns. Jawas scavenged among the bones of fallen ships, and in Mos Eisley's cantina the music played on, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell beyond the atmosphere. But on this day, something fell from the sky that did not belong. The phenomenon began as a distortion in the upper atmosphere, a ripple of energy that defied conventional sensor readings and appeared on no Imperial tracking grid. Freighter captains landing at the spaceport reported their navigational computers flickering, momentarily displaying coordinates that existed in no star chart. A Tusken raider scout, watching from the Jundland wastes, saw what his people would later describe as a tear in the fabric of the sky itself, a wound through which light poured in colors that had no name. The tear opened for less than 3 seconds. Through it fell a single object, tumbling through Tatooine's thin air with the grace of a leaf descending through water, slowing impossibly as it approached the surface, coming to rest in a shallow canyon 30 kilometers from Mos Eisley. The impact crater was small, barely 3 meters across, and the sand around it had fused into glass that reflected the afternoon light in patterns that hurt to observe for too long. At the center of the crater sat a sleek silver device, approximately 2 meters in length, smooth and featureless except for a single seam that ran along its perimeter. It bore no markings, no manufacturer's seal, no indication of origin or purpose, but it hummed with a frequency that set teeth on edge and made the air shimmer as though reality itself had developed a fever. Within 6 hours, scavengers had found it. Within 12, they were dead. The bodies were discovered by an Imperial patrol conducting routine sweeps for rebel sympathizers. 3 humans and a Rodian collapsed around the device as though struck down mid-step. There were no wounds, no signs of violence, no indication of what had killed them. Their faces bore expressions of profound terror, eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. The patrol captain, a veteran of the Clone Wars who had seen death in forms both conventional and exotic, reported the scene with language that bordered on the poetic in its unease. He described a pressure against his thoughts, a presence that pushed at the boundaries of his mind like hands pressing against a door from the inside. The device was secured and transported to the regional Imperial garrison, where it remained untouched in a shielded containment cell while officers argued about jurisdiction and protocol. The local MOF wanted it destroyed. The garrison commander wanted it studied. The science division wanted it transferred to Coruscant. While they debated, the device continued to hum, and personnel assigned to guard it began reporting headaches, vivid dreams, and the persistent sensation of being watched by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. The matter was resolved when Grand Admiral Thrawn himself expressed interest. The Chiss officer arrived in the Tattoo system aboard the Star Destroyer Chimera with minimal fanfare, accompanied only by his immediate staff and a complement of death troopers whose loyalty transcended the ordinary bonds of Imperial service. Thrawn's reputation preceded him like a storm front, whispers of his tactical genius filtering through command structures with the weight of prophecy. He was the alien who had risen to heights no non-human should achieve in the Empire's xenophobic hierarchy, the strategist who studied art to predict warfare, the mind that saw patterns where others saw only chaos. When he entered the garrison's containment facility, every officer present stood straighter, spoke more carefully, and wondered whether their careers would survive the encounter. Thrawn stood before the device for 17 minutes without speaking, his red eyes fixed on the silver surface with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. He did not order scans or measurements. He did not consult datapads or confer with technicians. He simply observed, and in that observation, something shifted in the room's atmosphere, as though the device recognized the quality of attention being directed toward it and responded in kind. "It is not a weapon," Thrawn said at last, his accent lending each word a precise weight. "It is a vessel." The garrison commander, a man whose competence had elevated him to comfortable irrelevance on a backwater world, cleared his throat. "Grand Admiral, our preliminary scans suggest some form of stasis technology, possibly of unknown origin." "Unknown to you?" Thrawn interrupted, still not turning from the device. "But not unknown. I have seen similar configurations in the art of 3 distinct civilizations, each separated by thousands of years and thousands of light years. The mathematics of the design suggests a purpose beyond mere transportation." He paused, head tilting slightly. "It suggests preservation, protection. A craft built not to carry cargo, but to carry someone precious through conditions that would otherwise prove fatal." "Should we attempt to open it?" the commander asked. "It is already opening." As if in response to Thrawn's words, the seam along the device's perimeter began to glow with soft blue light. The hum intensified, rising through frequencies that moved from audible to felt to something beyond physical sensation, a vibration that resonated in the bones and behind the eyes. The Death Troopers raised their weapons, technicians backed toward the exits. Thrawn remained perfectly still, his expression one of fascinated calm. The device split along its seam with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and from within rose a platform bearing a figure seated in a chair of black metal and silver circuitry. He was human, or appeared to be. A man perhaps in his 60s by Coruscant standard aging, with features that suggested both dignity and profound weariness. His head was hairless, his scalp bearing a sheen that caught the containment cell's harsh lighting. He wore clothing unlike anything in the Imperial catalogue, a dark suit of fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, cut with clean lines that suggested both formality and function. The chair itself was remarkable, a piece of technology that combined mobility with aesthetics in ways that seemed almost artistic. Repulsor fields hummed beneath it, keeping it suspended a hand's width above the ground. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. They opened slowly, revealing depths of intelligence and compassion that seemed fundamentally at odds with the sterile military environment in which he found himself. Eyes that had seen suffering and responded not with hate but with understanding. Eyes that looked at the Death Troopers' weapons with neither fear nor defiance, but with something more disturbing: pity. The man in the chair took a slow breath, then another, as though remembering how. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent none present could place, refined and controlled, each word emerging with the precision of someone who understood the power of language. "Where am I?" The question was simple. The effect was not. As he spoke, every person in the containment cell felt a sensation like fingertips brushing against their thoughts. Not invasive but unmistakable, a presence that acknowledged them as individuals rather than objects. Several technicians gasped. A Death Trooper's finger tightened involuntarily on his trigger. The garrison commander felt his surface thoughts exposed like cards spread on a table. His fears about the quarterly supply audit, his resentment of Thrawn's presence, his lingering shame over a decision made during the Clone Wars. Thrawn felt it too, but unlike the others, he did not recoil. Instead, he smiled, a slight upward curve of his lips that suggested both satisfaction and challenge. "You are in an Imperial garrison on Tatooine, a world in the Outer Rim," Thrawn said. "More importantly, You are in the presence of someone who has been expecting something like you to arrive, though I confess the timing is fortuitous." He stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that was simultaneously relaxed and commanding. "I am Grand Admiral Thrawn of the Galactic Empire. And you, I suspect, are something this galaxy has not encountered before. A telepath of sufficient power to be felt through shielding designed to contain Force sensitives." The man in the chair studied Thrawn with those penetrating eyes, and for a moment the two of them seemed to exist in a space separate from the others in the room, two intellects assessing each other across a gulf of species and circumstance. "My name is Charles Xavier," the man said, "and I am not sure how I came to be here. The last thing I remember was—" He paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. "A cosmic storm. The X-Men attempting a rescue operation near a temporal anomaly. And then nothing, just darkness and dreams of stars I did not recognize." "The Force works in mysterious ways," Thrawn observed, the comment delivered with the tone of someone testing a hypothesis. "Or perhaps what you are is evidence that the Force is not the only power that shapes consciousness in this universe. Tell me, Professor Xavier, what do you feel when you reach out with your mind? What do you sense in the men and women around you?" Xavier's gaze swept the room, touching each person present with that same gentle acknowledgement. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that seemed ancient. "I feel fear, conditioning, loyalty built on foundations of intimidation and propaganda. I feel men and women who have surrendered their capacity for independent moral judgment to a system that demands obedience above conscience." His eyes returned to Thrawn. "And in you, I feel something far more dangerous, a mind that has chosen this empire with full awareness of what it is. You are not a victim of indoctrination, Grand Admiral. You are its most sophisticated product." The garrison commander bristled, but Thrawn raised a hand to forestall any outburst. His smile had not diminished. "Accurate," Thrawn said, "and insufficient. You perceive the surface, Professor, but you do not yet understand the context. This galaxy is not your own. Its history, its conflicts, its very metaphysics operate according to rules that will be unfamiliar to you. The empire you condemn represents order in the aftermath of chaos. Without it, 1,000 systems would tear themselves apart in sectarian violence and warlord fiefdoms. The fear you sense in these soldiers is not mere intimidation. It is the necessary boundary between civilization and the abyss." "I have heard such arguments before," Xavier said quietly. "Always from men who believe the suffering they cause is justified by the stability they impose. Always from men who mistake control for peace. And I have encountered countless Force users who believed their connection to cosmic energy granted them moral authority," Thrawn replied. "The Jedi allowed a republic to rot from within, so committed to their abstract principles that they failed to see the real suffering of real people. Your telepathy makes you powerful, Professor Xavier, but power without understanding is merely force in a different form." The exchange was interrupted by a disturbance that rippled through the containment cell like a wave of invisible energy. Xavier's eyes widened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Several technicians cried out, stumbling backward. The Death Troopers remained standing, but even their disciplined stillness seemed compromised, as though something vast and inexplicable had just brushed against them all. "Impossible," Xavier whispered, and there was awe in his voice. "I felt that. Through all of you. A current, a living field of energy that connects every conscious being. It is not telepathy as I know it, but something related, something deeper." "The Force," Thrawn said, and now his voice carried a note of genuine interest. "You can perceive it, not as a Force sensitive would, but as an external phenomenon. Fascinating. It suggests your telepathic abilities operate on a similar but distinct principle, perhaps parallel rather than integrated. You are reading the ripples in the current, even if you cannot touch the current itself." Xavier closed his eyes, concentrating, and the room's atmosphere shifted again. This time the sensation was different, not a ripple but a focused beam, a narrow current of thought that passed from Xavier to Thrawn and back again, private and precise. "You intend to use me." Xavier's mental voice was clear as spoken words, "as a weapon against your enemies. You believe my abilities could break resistance movements, uncover conspiracies, bend minds to serve your Empire's order. You are already calculating applications and limitations, composing the report you will file, planning the systems of control you will build around my compliance." Thrawn's expression did not change, but something flickered in those red eyes. Respect, perhaps, or anticipation. "You are correct." Thrawn's response came not in words but in images and concepts, his mind proving remarkably disciplined despite its lack of telepathic training. "But you mistake my intent for simple exploitation. What I see in you is an opportunity to demonstrate that the Empire need not rely solely on fear. A mind that can show truth has more value than a dozen Star Destroyers. You could end rebellions by revealing to rebels the futility of their cause. You could expose the corruption that plagues even our own ranks. You could be the instrument that transforms the Empire from a machine of oppression into a genuine force for order, at the cost of every being's mental sovereignty," Xavier replied. "The power you describe is the power to erase free will itself. I would become the ultimate tyrant, the dictator who rules not through threats but through the violation of the self. I have spent my life fighting for coexistence and understanding. I will not become the weapon you envision, no matter how sophisticated the justification." The mental exchange ended as Thrawn broke contact, stepping back with a slight inclination of his head. "Noted," the Grand Admiral said aloud. "You will not cooperate willingly. This was expected. However, you should understand that you are now a resource of incalculable strategic value to the Empire, and the Empire does not relinquish such resources. You will be transported to a secure facility where your abilities can be properly studied and, eventually, properly directed toward constructive purposes." "I will resist," Xavier said simply. "Also expected," Thrawn replied. "But consider this, Professor. Your resistance, however principled, changes nothing about your situation. You are alone in a galaxy you do not understand, surrounded by technology and force deployments you cannot counter. You have no allies, no resources, no leverage beyond your own abilities. And while those abilities are formidable, they are not infinite." He gestured to the Death Troopers. "These soldiers have been trained to resist force suggestion. Their minds are disciplined, their conditioning reinforced through techniques developed over decades of combating force users. You may be able to read their thoughts, but influencing them will prove more difficult than you imagine." Xavier met Thrawn's gaze steadily. "You speak of what I cannot do, but you fail to account for what your Empire cannot prevent. Every mind I touch is a mind awakened to its own cage. Every soldier who feels my presence remembers that he is more than his conditioning. I do not need to turn your troops against you, Grand Admiral. I need only remind them that they are still human beneath the armor." For a long moment, silence held the room. Then Thrawn smiled again, this time with genuine amusement. "This will be instructive," he said, "for both of us." The transfer to the Chimera was conducted with elaborate security measures that revealed the Empire's paranoia, even as they demonstrated its organizational capacity. Xavier's chair was surrounded by a portable containment field, itself carried by a repulsor sled operated remotely. 6 Death Troopers formed a perimeter, their weapons trained inward rather than outward, their helmets equipped with neural dampeners that Thrawn assured Xavier would make telepathic influence substantially more difficult. A pair of force-nullifying pylons, technology salvaged from the Jedi Purge, flanked the procession, their crystalline structures pulsing with energy that made Xavier's head ache and his abilities feel muffled, as though he were trying to sense thoughts through layers of thick fabric. The garrison's landing bay was a study in Imperial efficiency. Clean lines, organized equipment, personnel moving with the synchronized precision that came from training and fear. As Xavier was transported across the ferrocrete floor toward the waiting shuttle, he reached out with his mind, despite the discomfort of the nullifying pylons, touching the surface thoughts of the soldiers and technicians they passed. Corporal Jens Marek, 3rd Watch, Weapons Maintenance, exhausted from double shifts, worried about his sister on Corellia, numb to the violence he witnessed daily, using humor and routine to avoid thinking too deeply about what the Empire asked him to do. Lieutenant Shara Vess, Intelligence Division, ambitious, calculating, secretly despising the xenophobia that prevented her advancement, believing she could reform the system from within if she just climbed high enough. Private Davin Tor, fresh recruit, terrified, homesick, clinging to the Academy's promises that he served order and peace, already beginning to suspect those promises were lies but lacking the framework to articulate his doubts. Each mind was a story, a life reduced to function and fear, potential locked behind walls of conditioning and exhaustion. Xavier felt the weight of it settle over him like a physical burden. These were not monsters. They were people who had been shaped by circumstance and propaganda into instruments of oppression. The tragedy was not that they were evil. The tragedy was that they were ordinary. The shuttle ride to the Chimera took 11 minutes. Xavier spent them in silence, aware of Thrawn seated across from him, studying him with that unblinking red gaze. The Death Troopers stood at attention despite the turbulence of atmospheric exit. Through the viewport, Tatooine fell away, its desert surface giving way to the black of space and the massive triangular silhouette of the Star Destroyer hanging in orbit like a dagger pointed at the planet below. "You are troubled," Thrawn observed, "not by your captivity, but by what you sensed in the garrison personnel." "I am troubled by what has been done to them," Xavier replied. "The systematic destruction of empathy, the replacement of moral reasoning with obedience. You have created an army of people who have forgotten how to question." "I have inherited such an army," Thrawn corrected. "The Empire's methods of indoctrination were established long before I achieved my current rank, but your assessment is incomplete. These soldiers have not forgotten how to question. They have learned that questioning leads to punishment, and that, in a galaxy prone to chaos, the certainty of order has value, even when that order is imperfect." "Imperfect," Xavier echoed, and there was steel beneath the gentleness of his voice. "An interesting euphemism for tyranny." "Tyranny is merely governance that one disapproves of," Thrawn said. "The Jedi enforced their will across the galaxy for 1,000 generations, removing Force-sensitive children from their families, imposing their interpretations of light and dark, serving as unelected arbiters of Republic policy. Was that not tyranny, or does the use of a more subtle power make it somehow more acceptable?" The shuttle docked in the Chimera's main hangar, and the debate was suspended as the ramp lowered to reveal a chamber that made the garrison seem provincial by comparison. The hangar was immense, capable of holding dozens of TIE fighters and support craft, its walls lined with racks of ordnance and maintenance equipment. Stormtroopers stood in perfect ranks along the pathway to the exit, their white armor gleaming under harsh lights. Officers watched from elevated observation platforms, their gray uniforms and cap insignia denoting ranks and specializations. Everything spoke of power consolidated and maintained through meticulous organization. Xavier was transported through corridors whose architecture seemed designed to overwhelm individual identity. Long, featureless passages where footsteps echoed, and every surface reflected sterile light. They passed crew quarters where off-duty personnel snapped to attention at the sight of Death Troopers, mess halls where hundreds ate in synchronized shifts, training rooms where soldiers practiced violence with mechanical precision. The Chimera was not merely a ship. It was a city devoted to war, and every one of its 5,000 crew members was a component in that machine. His destination was a cell in the detention level, but unlike the crude containment on Tatooine, this was a chamber designed with his specific abilities in mind. The walls were lined with force-nullifying crystal lattices that hummed with energy. The door was blast-proof and magnetically sealed. Surveillance equipment watched from every angle. And surrounding the cell, Thrawn explained as Xavier was moved inside, was a network of neural dampeners powerful enough to reduce even a trained Force user's abilities to whispers. "You will be comfortable," Thrawn said. gesturing to the modest furnishings. A bed, a desk, a refresher unit. Your cooperation would expand these accommodations significantly. Books, data access, perhaps even limited movement around the ship under guard. All I require is your willingness to engage with the reality of your situation. Xavier's chair settled to the cell floor as the repulsor sled withdrew. The containment field powered down. The death troopers filed out, leaving only Thrawn standing in the doorway. "I was a teacher," Xavier said quietly. "I founded a school for young people with abilities that frightened them and others. I taught them that their gifts were not curses, that they could choose to use their power for good rather than domination. I spent my life building bridges between humans and mutants, fighting against hatred and fear." He met Thrawn's gaze. "You asked me to become the very thing I opposed, a mind that forces compliance rather than earns understanding. I cannot do that, Grand Admiral. Not for comfort, not for freedom, not even to survive." Thrawn regarded him for a long moment, and something in that alien face suggested almost sadness. "Then you will remain here," the Grand Admiral said, "until circumstance or wisdom changes your position. I do not enjoy waste, Professor Xavier, and you are perhaps the greatest waste of potential I have encountered in my service to the Empire." The door sealed with a hiss of pressurizing atmosphere, and Xavier was alone. The silence was profound. Xavier closed his eyes and reached out with his telepathy, expecting to find nothing beyond the dampening fields. But the nullifying crystals, sophisticated as they were, had been designed to suppress the Force, not his particular strain of mental ability. His power functioned through different mechanisms, touching the electrical patterns of conscious thought rather than the mystical currents that Jedi and Sith manipulated. The dampeners muffled his range, reduced his precision, but they did not eliminate his gift entirely. He could still feel them, the minds of the Chimera's crew, 5,000 souls moving through their assigned roles like blood through a body. The sheer scale of consciousness was overwhelming, a roar of thought and emotion that threatened to drown his individual awareness. Xavier had learned long ago how to filter such noise, to focus on specific minds, or to perceive the collective as a pattern rather than a cacophony. He did so now, letting his awareness expand through the ship in careful waves. Ensign Kolar. Navigation Division. Calculating hyperspace coordinates, mind numb with routine, thinking about the promotion he had been promised 3 months ago. Technician Wex, Engineering Bay. Exhausted from a 14-hour shift, muscle memory guiding her hands through repairs, dreaming of retirement on a colony world she would likely never afford to reach. Stormtrooper TK-5598. Standing guard at a checkpoint, bored and uncomfortable in his armor. Remembering his childhood on Naboo before the Empire absorbed the planet's identity into its monolithic structure. Each mind was a world, and each world was a tragedy of potential constrained by fear and propaganda. Xavier felt the old familiar sorrow settle over him. These people were not his enemies. They were victims of a system that ground individuals into components and called the result order. But beneath the surface thoughts, Xavier sensed something else. Cracks in the conditioning, moments of doubt that flickered like sparks in the dark. Kolar wondering if the navigation coordinates he calculated led to missions he should question. Wex remembering a protest she had seen broken up by stormtroopers, the violence lingering in her memory like a wound. TK-5598 thinking about the face of a rebel prisoner he had seen executed, the man's last words about freedom echoing in the stormtrooper's thoughts despite his training. These cracks were small, almost invisible, easily suppressed and rationalized, but they were present, and presence meant possibility. Xavier opened his eyes and looked at the blank walls of his cell. He thought of his students, the X-Men, the school he had built on the principle that change began with understanding. He thought of the battles he had fought against hatred, the enemies he had faced not with violence but with the persistent, patient work of opening closed minds. The scale here was larger, the opposition more organized, the danger more immediate, but the principle remained the same. He could not force the Empire's soldiers to rebel. That would make him the tyrant Thrawn wanted him to be. But he could remind them of who they were beneath the conditioning. He could touch their doubts and nurture them into questions. He could be, in the darkness of Imperial service, a small voice whispering that another way was possible. It would take time. It would require patience and precision, and it would be the most dangerous work of his life. But Charles Xavier had never chosen the easy path, and he would not start now, 5,000 light-years from home, locked in a cell aboard a star destroyer commanded by a brilliant alien who believed tyranny was merely a form of order. The Force shuddered, though Xavier could not name the sensation. In the vastness of space beyond the Chimera's hull, something ancient and aware took note of the new pattern in the galaxy's tapestry. The Jedi were gone, murdered or scattered. The Sith had consolidated power, and now a third force had entered the equation, a mind that touched consciousness without the Force's mediation, offering a kind of liberation that no prophecy had foreseen. The galaxy waited to see what such a mind would do. Days passed in the cell, measured only by the shift changes Xavier sensed in the crew's collective consciousness and the meals delivered by silent droids through a wall slot. Thrawn did not visit, but Xavier felt the Grand Admiral's presence nonetheless. A brilliant mind working through strategic problems several layers deep, always calculating, always observing patterns others missed. The Chiss was monitoring Xavier's condition remotely, tracking his moods through surveillance and the reports of guards whose surface thoughts betrayed their unease. They feared him, these soldiers. Not because he had harmed anyone, but because his presence made them feel seen in ways that armor and conditioning were supposed to prevent. TK-5598, the stormtrooper from Naboo, stood guard outside Xavier's cell for 6-hour shifts, and spent every moment fighting the sensation that the prisoner knew things about him that he barely acknowledged himself. The trooper's thoughts were a battlefield where duty clashed with memory, where the promise of order fought against the reality of what maintaining that order required. Xavier did not push. He merely listened, his telepathy a gentle presence that acknowledged rather than invaded. And slowly, incrementally, TK-5598 began to think more clearly about the contradictions that his training had taught him to ignore. On the third day, the stormtrooper thought about the protest on Naboo. On the fourth day, he remembered the faces of the protesters, young people his own age demanding representation in a government that claimed to speak for them. On the fifth day, he allowed himself to wonder if their demands had been unreasonable. On the sixth day, he thought the word justice, and did not immediately suppress it with rationalizations about necessary security measures. Small victories, incremental shifts, the kind of patient work that Xavier had perfected over decades of teaching young mutants to see their abilities as gifts rather than curses. But each small shift rippled outward, touching other minds, creating patterns of doubt that spread through the Chimera's crew like ripples through water. Thrawn noticed. Of course he noticed. The Grand Admiral's intelligence reports began to flag minor irregularities, a slight increase in sickbay visits for stress-related complaints, an uptick in requests for personal time, subtle decreases in response efficiency during emergency drills. Nothing that suggested mutiny or sabotage, but patterns nonetheless, anomalies in the machine's smooth operation. And at the center of the pattern, like a stone dropped into still water, was the detention cell where Charles Xavier sat in quiet meditation, reaching out with his mind to touch the consciousness of 5,000 souls. The summons came on the 7th day. Xavier was escorted from his cell by a full complement of death troopers, the neural dampeners reactivated to their maximum setting. The walk through the Chimera's corridors felt different now. Crew members who had regarded him as a curiosity or threat before now looked away when he passed, their thoughts complicated by doubts they could not quite articulate. Xavier felt their confusion like a physical presence, the cognitive dissonance of people whose worldview was beginning to crack under the weight of questions they had been trained never to ask. Thrawn waited in his private office, a chamber that reflected the Grand Admiral's aesthetic sensibilities with almost painful clarity. The walls were lined with art, sculptures from a dozen cultures, paintings that depicted scenes of conquest and tragedy, holographic displays showing battles fought centuries or millennia ago. Each piece was positioned with deliberate care, creating a conversation between objects separated by vast spans of time and space. The effect was both beautiful and unsettling, a reminder that Thrawn saw patterns where others saw only random artifacts. The Grand Admiral stood before a painting of what appeared to be a battle between ground forces and a massive creature emerging from a planetary core, his hands clasped behind his back, his attention fully absorbed by the artwork. He did not turn as Xavier was brought in, and the Death Troopers assumed their positions around the room's perimeter. "Tell me what you see," Thrawn said, gesturing to the painting. Xavier studied the image. The artist had captured motion and violence with remarkable skill. Soldiers fleeing, weapons firing uselessly against armored hide, a city crumbling in the background as the creature rose. But there was something else in the composition. A secondary narrative suggested by the placement of figures and the use of light. "I see terror," Xavier said carefully, "but also unity. The soldiers are from different units, different species, but they fight together against a common threat. The artist wants me to understand that the creature is less important than the response it provokes." "A civilization on the verge of collapse," Thrawn said, finally turning to face Xavier. "Dozens of factions, each jealous of its autonomy, each more interested in positioning for advantage than addressing the systemic failures threatening them all. And then the creature emerged from their planet's core, a manifestation of geological forces they had ignored in their political squabbles. Faced with extinction, they unified. They set aside differences. They became, briefly, what they should have been all along." "And what became of them?" Xavier asked. "They survived," Thrawn said. "And then, within a generation, they had fractured again into their constituent factions, the memory of unity fading into myth. The lesson is not that crisis creates cooperation. The lesson is that cooperation without structure is temporary. The Empire understands this. We provide the structure that makes cooperation permanent. Through force," Xavier said, "through the elimination of choice, through the establishment of necessary boundaries," Thrawn corrected. He moved to his desk, activating a holographic display that showed the Chimera's crew efficiency ratings over the past week. The graphs displayed subtle but measurable declines across multiple metrics. "You have been conducting an experiment, Professor Xavier, using your abilities not to command, but to suggest, planting doubts rather than orders. A more subtle approach than I anticipated, and in some ways more dangerous." Xavier met the Grand Admiral's gaze steadily. "I have done nothing but allow your people to think clearly about their circumstances. If that produces inefficiency, perhaps the efficiency was built on suppression rather than genuine commitment." "An interesting hypothesis," Thrawn said. "Let me offer an alternative interpretation. You are introducing chaos into a functioning system, mistaking the resulting disruption for moral progress. These crew members perform essential functions that keep this ship operational. Their doubts, however philosophically valid, serve only to compromise the effectiveness of their assigned roles. In a combat situation, such hesitation could mean the difference between life and death, not just for them, but for their fellow crew members. Or it could mean the difference between following orders that lead to atrocity and refusing to participate in evil." Xavier replied, "You speak of efficiency and combat readiness, but you ignore the moral dimension entirely. These people are not components, Grand Admiral. They are individuals with consciences, and what you call efficiency is simply the measure of how successfully you have suppressed those consciences." Thrawn tilted his head, a gesture that suggested both curiosity and calculation. "You believe consciousness and conscience are the same thing. They are not. A being can be fully conscious and still choose to serve purposes you would consider immoral. I serve the Empire not because my conscience has been suppressed, but because I have evaluated the alternatives and concluded that Imperial order, despite its flaws, represents the best available option for galactic stability. "Then you are more a prisoner than any of your crew," Xavier said quietly, "because you have convinced yourself that your choice was free when it was shaped by every circumstance of your life. You are Chiss in a xenophobic empire, proving your worth by serving it more effectively than its human officers. You are a student of art and culture who works for a regime that destroys both. You have wrapped your chains in the language of necessity and called it freedom." For the first time, something shifted in Thrawn's expression. Not anger, but something sharper, recognition of a truth that cut deeper than strategy or politics. "You are perceptive," the Grand Admiral said after a pause, "but perception without power is merely observation. You can identify the nature of my choices, but you cannot change the reality in which those choices were made. The Empire exists. The Rebellion, for all its idealism, offers only chaos in place of structure. And you, Professor Xavier, are a single mind trapped aboard a ship you cannot escape, surrounded by forces you do not understand." "I understand enough," Xavier replied. "I understand that every person on this ship is one choice away from remembering who they are. I understand that the Empire's power rests not on star destroyers or stormtroopers, but on the willingness of ordinary people to surrender their moral agency. And I understand that even small acts of conscience, accumulated across thousands of individuals, can shift the balance of tyranny." Thrawn studied him for a long moment, those red eyes weighing and measuring. Then the Grand Admiral reached to his desk and activated a communicator. "Commander Vanto, prepare a shuttle. The prisoner will be transferred to the Imperial Security Bureau facility on Scarif." Xavier felt the words land like a physical blow. Scarif, a world whose name he did not know but whose significance he read immediately in Thrawn's surface thoughts. A maximum security installation dedicated to the suppression of Force sensitives and other individuals whose abilities posed threats to Imperial stability. A place where Xavier's carefully nurtured patience would mean nothing, where interrogation techniques refined over decades would be brought to bear against his resistance. "You are removing me because you fear what I am doing," Xavier said. "I am removing you because what you are doing serves no constructive purpose aboard this vessel," Thrawn replied. "The ISB has resources and specialists who can better evaluate your abilities and determine whether they can be directed toward useful applications. You will be treated well, Professor, insofar as your cooperation merits. But you will no longer have access to this crew." "You cannot stop me from reaching mines," Xavier said, and felt his power surge against the dampeners, touching the consciousness of the Death Troopers in the room, the crew members in adjacent corridors, spreading outward in waves that made his head ache, but his will remained firm. "Your technology suppresses the Force, but I am not Force-sensitive. I am something you have no framework to contain." In the space between heartbeats, Xavier pushed harder than he had since arriving in this galaxy, reaching through the neural dampeners with precision born from decades of practice. He touched TK-5598's mind directly, not to command but to amplify the doubts that had been growing over the past week. The stormtrooper, standing guard outside Thrawn's office, felt the full weight of his suppressed conscience land on him like a collapsing wall. TK-5598 remembered Naboo, remembered the protest, remembered the young woman who had been beaten by riot troopers for holding a sign that read, "Systems have rights." Remembered his own paralysis, his own silence, his own complicity. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full horror of what he had become. The stormtrooper's weapon clattered to the floor. The sound was shockingly loud in the office's careful quiet. Thrawn's head turned toward the door, his expression unreadable. Xavier felt the Death Troopers in the room tense, their training warring with the sudden surge of doubt he had transmitted through the ship's neural network like a pulse of electromagnetic energy. "Stand down," Thrawn said sharply, though it was unclear whether he was addressing the Death Troopers or speaking to Xavier himself. TK-5598 removed his helmet with shaking hands. The face beneath was young, human, scarred by acne and exhaustion. Tears tracked down his cheeks. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "I can't do this anymore." I can't pretend it's right. I can't keep telling myself that order justifies everything. I'm done. Xavier felt the moment cascade through the surrounding minds. Shock, confusion, a sudden and terrifying awareness that the foundations of certainty could crack. 2 more stormtroopers in the corridor beyond Thrawn's office felt the same paralysis hit them, the same sudden clarity about what their service entailed. Within the detention level 3 floors below, a guard looked at the cells filled with political prisoners and thought, for the first time, about what constituted a crime worthy of such punishment. The rebellion was not in arms. It was in awareness. Thrawn moved with characteristic decisiveness. He activated his desk communicator and spoke a series of commands in clipped military tones, ordering security reinforcements, medical personnel to assess affected crew members for neurological tampering, and the immediate activation of ship-wide neural dampening protocols. Within seconds, the Chimera's systems responded. Additional nullifying fields powering up, surveillance intensifying, the machine mobilizing to suppress the glitch in its operation. But Xavier had made his point. The Empire's strength was also its vulnerability. Strip away the conditioning, remind people of their conscience, and the entire structure teetered. Take him to the shuttle, Thrawn ordered the Death Troopers. Maximum security protocols, and sedate him if necessary. The Death Troopers moved forward, their training reasserting itself through the momentary doubt Xavier had introduced. But as they surrounded his chair and began to escort him from the office, Xavier reached out one final time to Thrawn's mind. Not to attack or persuade, but simply to show the Grand Admiral something he had perhaps forgotten or never known. He showed Thrawn a memory from his own past. A young Charles Xavier, newly aware of his telepathic gifts, terrified by the cacophony of thoughts around him, convinced he was going insane. And then another mutant, an older telepath, reaching out to help him understand that his abilities were not a curse but a responsibility. The memory of that compassion, that willingness to help rather than exploit, had shaped everything Xavier became. You could have been this. Xavier's thought touched Thrawn's disciplined mind with the lightness of falling snow. You have the intelligence, the will, the strategic brilliance. You could have used them to build rather than enforce. Instead, you chose to be the Empire's sharpest weapon, telling yourself it was necessity when it was simply the path of least resistance for someone who wanted to prove his worth to those who would never truly value him. Thrawn's face remained impassive, but Xavier felt the hit land, saw the micro-expression of pain that flickered across those red eyes before iron discipline reasserted itself. Then, Xavier was being moved through corridors filled with crew members, whose thoughts churned with new questions, past stormtroopers whose hands trembled on their weapons, toward a shuttle that would carry him to a facility designed to break minds like his. But he had planted seeds, and seeds, given time, grew. The shuttle bay was chaos, barely restrained by military discipline. Commander Vanto, Thrawn's second in command, stood at the center of a storm of activity, issuing orders to security teams while simultaneously coordinating with the ISB facility on Scarif. Around him, crew members moved with the efficiency of long practice, but Xavier could feel the undercurrent of unease in their thoughts. Word had spread about the stormtrooper who had removed his helmet, about the other crew members reporting confusion and disturbing thoughts. The Chimera was experiencing something unprecedented. A crisis not of external threat, but of internal certainty. Xavier was loaded onto the shuttle with elaborate caution. His chair locked into a floor-mounted clamp, additional restraints activated, and a portable dampening unit positioned to directly target his neurological activity. 2 Death Troopers took up positions on either side of him, while a third piloted the craft. Through the shuttle's small viewport, Xavier watched the Chimera recede, the massive Star Destroyer hanging against the black like a monument to Imperial power. The hyperspace jump to Scarif would take several hours. Xavier spent them in meditation, his mind ranging outward despite the dampener's best efforts. He could no longer touch individual thoughts with clarity at this distance, but he could sense the broad patterns. The ripples he had created aboard the Chimera, spreading through crew consciousness like waves through water, doubts multiplying and connecting, small acts of conscience accumulating into something larger. TK-5598 was in the brig now. Under medical observation, his defection being analyzed by security specialists who could not explain how a soldier with perfect loyalty scores had suddenly broken. But the analysts' own thoughts betrayed their unease. They wondered if the breakdown was truly spontaneous or if it spoke to stresses present throughout the crew. They thought about their own doubts, quickly suppressed, about whether the empire they served was the same one they had been promised in the academy. Xavier felt those thoughts with satisfaction. He was not trying to incite rebellion through his abilities. He was simply removing the barriers that prevented people from seeing clearly what they served. The rest was up to them. The shuttle emerged from hyperspace in the Scarif system, and Xavier got his first view of the tropical world below, a planet of turquoise oceans and white sand beaches, beautiful in ways that seemed to mock its function as a high-security detention and research facility. The Imperial complex dominated the view as they descended, a massive array of towers and bunkers surrounded by shield generators and defensive emplacements, all of it gleaming in the light of Scarif's sun. The landing was precise, the shuttle touching down on a platform where armed guards waited in formation. Xavier was transferred with the same elaborate caution, moved through security checkpoints where scanners analyzed everything from his bioelectric signature to the quantum state of particles in his immediate vicinity. The ISB took no chances with force sensitives, and though Xavier was not one, the precautions designed for them applied to him by default. His destination was a cell deep in the complex's central tower, a chamber that made the Chimera's detention level seem welcoming by comparison. The walls were lined with dampening crystals that glowed with cold blue light. The air smelled of ozone and recycled atmosphere. And sitting at a small table in the center of the room, waiting with the patient stillness of a predator, was an Imperial interrogator whose thoughts struck Xavier like a blade, cold, focused, utterly convinced of his right to extract truth by any means necessary. "Professor Charles Xavier," the interrogator said, his voice modulated to remove all warmth. "I am Agent Callus of the Imperial Security Bureau. You have been designated a Class 1 threat to Imperial security based on your demonstrated abilities and your refusal to cooperate with Grand Admiral Thrawn's investigation. My assignment is to determine the extent of your capabilities and to secure your compliance with Imperial objectives." Xavier studied the man before him. Human, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological manipulation. Callus's thoughts were remarkably disciplined, his mind structured in ways that suggested training specifically designed to resist telepathic intrusion. But beneath the discipline, Xavier sensed something else, doubt so deeply buried that Callus himself might not consciously acknowledge it. Questions about whether the methods he employed truly served justice or merely served power. "I will not submit to your interrogation," Xavier said calmly. "Not out of fear, but as a matter of principle. The techniques you will employ are designed to break will and conscience. I cannot allow my abilities to be weaponized in that fashion." Callus smiled, the expression carrying no humor. "You misunderstand your situation, Professor. You believe your refusal carries weight. It does not. We have spent decades perfecting methods of extracting information and compliance from force sensitives whose powers dwarf conventional understanding. You are telepathic, yes, but you are also human, with human vulnerabilities and human limits. We will find those limits, and once we do, you will serve the Empire whether you wish to or not." The interrogation began. Callus employed a layered approach, combining pharmaceutical intervention with sensory manipulation and precisely calibrated psychological pressure. The drugs were designed to lower mental defenses without completely destroying consciousness, a delicate balance meant to make Xavier more suggestible while keeping him coherent enough to use his abilities. The sensory manipulation involved patterns of light and sound tuned to frequencies that disrupted concentration and induced anxiety. and the psychological pressure came through questions, accusations, and the steady erosion of hope. But Charles Xavier had been fighting battles of the mind since before Kallus was born. The drugs affected him, making his thoughts swim and his focus waver, but his telepathy remained functional, if impaired. The sensory attacks were painful but bearable, waves of discomfort that he learned to ride rather than resist. And the psychological pressure founded against a core of conviction that had been tested in battles against enemies far more sophisticated than an Imperial interrogator. As hours stretched into days, Xavier turned the interrogation into a different kind of dialogue. He answered Kallus's questions with questions of his own, probing not for information but for conscience. He showed Kallus memories not of his own abilities, but of the people Kallus had broken in previous interrogations, rebels who had died rather than betray their comrades, Force sensitives whose minds Kallus had shattered in the name of security, ordinary citizens whose crime had been to speak truth about Imperial corruption. Kallus felt those memories like acid on exposed nerves. His discipline held, but Xavier could sense the cost of maintaining it, the psychic strain of confronting the consequences of his own actions. The interrogator's thoughts became a battlefield where training fought against recognition, where the need to believe in his mission clashed with the growing awareness of what that mission had demanded. On the fourth day of interrogation, Kallus made a mistake. Exhausted and frustrated by Xavier's resistance, he allowed his guard to slip just enough for Xavier to touch a memory the interrogator had buried deep. A moment early in Kallus's career, when he had questioned orders to execute prisoners without trial, only to be reminded by his superior that questioning led to dismissal or worse. The memory carried the weight of a turning point, the moment when Kallus had chosen career over conscience and had spent every day since building walls to avoid confronting that choice. Xavier did not invade the memory. He simply acknowledged it, his telepathic touch gentle as a whisper. You know what you are. You have always known. The question is whether you will continue to be it. Kallus stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the cell floor. His face was pale, his hands trembling despite his efforts at control. He stared at Xavier for a long moment, and something in that stare suggested a man looking into an abyss. You will break, Kallus said, but his voice carried no conviction. Everyone breaks eventually. Not into what you want, Xavier replied. Break me, and you destroy what makes me useful. Leave me whole, and I will continue to remind you and everyone around me that there is another way to be. Your choice, Agent Kallus. But choose wisely, because I suspect you have very few choices left before the weight of your conscience collapses your carefully constructed rationalizations. Kallus left the cell without another word, sealing the door behind him. Xavier slumped in his chair, exhausted by the effort of maintaining his defenses and his offensive simultaneously. The drugs in his system made his head swim. The sensory attacks had left him with a headache that felt like iron bands around his skull. But he had accomplished something important. He had shown an Imperial interrogator that the tools of psychological warfare could be turned against those who wielded them. In the days that followed, Kallus did not return. Other interrogators took his place, each employing variations on the same techniques, each finding Xavier resistant in ways that frustrated their training. The Scarif facility was designed to break Force users, but Xavier's abilities operated through different mechanisms, and the distinction made him harder to contain. His telepathy slipped through gaps in the dampening fields. His discipline, forged through decades of teaching and mental combat, held against drugs and disorientation. And most importantly, his mission gave him strength. Every interrogator he touched with his awareness was another mind exposed to the possibility of conscience. Word of his resistance spread through the facility. Guards assigned to his section began to experience the same doubts that had afflicted the Chimera's crew. Technicians maintaining the dampening equipment found themselves thinking about what their work enabled. Even the facility's commander, a hardened veteran named Moff Derek, felt the weight of Xavier's presence like a stone pressing against his certainty. The Empire was discovering that telepathy was not merely a weapon to be seized. It was a mirror that reflected truth, and truth was the most dangerous force in a system built on lies. On the 16th day of his captivity on Scarif, Xavier was visited by someone he had not expected, an emissary from the rebellion. The woman entered his cell, escorted by guards whose thoughts betrayed confusion and unease. She was human, perhaps 40 standard years old, with the lean build of someone who had spent years moving between worlds and the careful eyes of someone who had learned to evaluate threats in fractions of a second. Her clothes were nondescript, civilian attire that could pass in a dozen systems, but her bearing suggested military training imperfectly concealed. And her thoughts, when Xavier touched them, were a revelation. This was Mon Mothma, one of the rebellion's senior leaders, a woman whose voice carried weight in councils that decided the fate of star systems. "Professor Xavier," Mon Mothma said, her voice carrying the refined tones of Chandrila aristocracy. "I apologize for the deception required to secure this meeting. The Empire believes I am here negotiating prisoner exchanges. In reality, I came to speak with you." Xavier studied her carefully, his telepathy probing not to invade but to assess. Her mind was disciplined but not closed, her thoughts revealing a complex mixture of hope and calculation. She had heard about him through intelligence channels, about the telepath whose mere presence disrupted Imperial cohesion, and she had come to determine whether he might be an asset to the rebellion's cause. "You want to recruit me," Xavier said flatly. "You believe my abilities could turn the tide of your war by breaking Imperial morale and revealing their plans." Mon Mothma did not deny it. "The rebellion fights with limited resources against an enemy whose power seems unlimited. We cannot match the Empire ship for ship or soldier for soldier. But if we could undermine their certainty, if we could show their troops that they serve an unjust cause, we might achieve through minds what we cannot achieve through weapons. And in doing so, you would make me exactly what the Empire wants me to be," Xavier replied. "A weapon that operates through consciousness rather than violence. You dress it in different language, call it liberation rather than control, but the principle is the same. You want me to violate the autonomy of individual minds to serve a political objective. The Empire violates that autonomy every day," Mon Mothma countered. "Through propaganda, through indoctrination, through the systematic destruction of independent thought. What you describe as violation, I would call restoration. You would not be creating loyalty to the rebellion. You would be removing the barriers that prevent people from seeing the truth of what they serve." "A subtle distinction," Xavier said, "but an important one. I do not remove barriers. I acknowledge what lies beneath them. There is a difference between showing someone the cage and forcing them to leave it. The first respects agency. The second merely replaces one form of control with another." Mon Mothma leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. "Then show them the cage. Show every stormtrooper, every officer, every Imperial citizen what their Empire truly is. Show them the destroyed worlds, the massacred populations, the systematic erasure of cultures and freedoms, and then let them choose. They will not all choose as you wish," Xavier warned. "Many will rationalize what they see, will convince themselves that such costs are necessary for order. Others will break under the weight of their complicity, and some will find a third path that serves neither Empire nor rebellion. Are you prepared for that uncertainty?" For a long moment, Mon Mothma was silent, her thoughts revealing the calculations of a leader who had learned to weigh terrible options against worse ones. Finally, she spoke. "I am prepared for anything that weakens the Empire's hold on this galaxy. We are desperate, Professor Xavier. The Death Star's destruction bought us time, but the Empire is rebuilding, consolidating, tightening its grip on systems that might have wavered. If we do not act decisively, the window for meaningful resistance will close. Your abilities represent a chance to strike at the Empire's foundation in ways that no military operation could achieve." Xavier felt the weight of her desperation, the exhaustion of a leader who had spent years fighting a war that seemed unwinnable. He also felt her integrity. Mon Mothma genuinely believed in the cause she served, genuinely wanted freedom for the galaxy's peoples, genuinely wrestled with the moral costs of her decisions. "I will not serve your rebellion," Xavier said carefully, "but I will not oppose it either. What I will do is continue what I have been doing, acknowledging the truth of people's circumstances and allowing them to reckon with that truth themselves. If that serves your goals, so be it. But I will not be directed or controlled by either side of this conflict." Mon Mothma studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you are more valuable than I realized. A conscience that serves no faction is the most dangerous force in a galaxy built on choosing sides." She stood, preparing to leave. "We will extract you from this facility within 3 days. Be ready." "I did not agree to extraction," Xavier began, but Mon Mothma interrupted with a slight smile. "You are a prisoner on a world that will imprison or kill you, regardless of your neutrality. The rebellion offers you something the Empire never will: the freedom to act according to your principles rather than theirs. Consider it less a recruitment than an opportunity." She left before Xavier could respond, her guards falling into formation around her, their thoughts already shifting to the complex logistics of extracting a prisoner from an Imperial maximum security facility. Xavier sat in his cell after she departed, feeling the currents of conflict swirl around him with increasing intensity. He had entered this galaxy by accident, a victim of cosmic forces he did not understand. But he was being pulled into its central struggle whether he wished it or not. The Empire wanted him as a weapon. The rebellion wanted him as a symbol. And Charles Xavier, who had spent his life trying to find a third path between control and chaos, was being forced to navigate waters whose depths he could only begin to fathom. 3 days, Mon Mothma had said, 3 days to decide whether liberation from one cage was worth the risk of entering another. Xavier closed his eyes and reached out with his mind across the facility, touching the thoughts of guards and prisoners, interrogators and administrators, all of them bound by the choices they had made and the circumstances that shaped those choices. Each mind was a world. Each world was a possibility, and in a galaxy at war, possibility was the most precious resource of all. The Force shuddered again, that strange cosmic current responding to Xavier's expanding awareness. Somewhere in the deep core, an ancient being stirred, sensing a disturbance that did not fit the eternal dance of light and dark. And on Tatooine, in the home of an old hermit who was all that remained of the Jedi Order, Obi-Wan Kenobi opened his eyes from meditation with a troubled expression, feeling echoes of something that should not exist in the Force but somehow did. The galaxy was changing in ways that prophecy had not predicted, and Charles Xavier, teacher and telepath, prisoner and conscience, was at the center of that change whether he sought it or not. The extraction came on the 3rd night in the form of a brief but intense firefight that lit up Scarif's tropical darkness with blaster bolts and explosions. Xavier felt the assault begin before the alarms sounded, his telepathy sensing the rebel strike team's coordinated thoughts as they breached the facility's outer defenses. There were 8 of them, minds trained in combat and sacrifice, each carrying the weight of missions that had succeeded and comrades who had not survived those successes. The facility responded with overwhelming force. Stormtroopers mobilized from barracks, automated defense systems activated, and the tower where Xavier was held went into lockdown protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. But the rebels had planned meticulously, exploiting blind spots in surveillance and security rotations, using a combination of slicing expertise and inside information to navigate obstacles that should have been insurmountable. Xavier remained in his cell, listening to the chaos unfold through the minds of those fighting it. He felt a stormtrooper die, the man's consciousness extinguished in an instant of searing pain, his last thought a confused fragment about his family on Corellia. He felt a rebel fighter fall wounded, her determination to complete the mission overriding the agony of a blaster burn. He felt Moff Derek in the command center, coordinating the defense with mechanical precision while privately calculating whether the prisoner was worth the casualties mounting in the assault's wake. The strike team reached his level 14 minutes into the operation. The door to his cell exploded inward in a shower of sparks and molten metal, revealing figures in combat gear whose faces were hidden behind helmets, but whose thoughts identified them as professionals. Former soldiers, some, or people who had learned warfare through bitter necessity. Their leader was a Twi'lek woman named Hera Syndulla, her mind revealing decades of fighting against impossible odds with a combination of skill and hope that Xavier found simultaneously admirable and tragic. "Professor Xavier?" Hera's voice was clipped, urgent. "We're here to extract you. Can you move?" "My chair requires power," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding the environment. "The dampening fields have kept it inactive." One of the rebels, a human tech specialist, moved forward with a portable power unit and began working to bypass the clamps holding Xavier's chair. His hands moved with practiced speed, but his thoughts betrayed nervousness. This was taking too long. Security would converge on their position. They might have to abort without the asset. Xavier reached out with his telepathy, touching the minds of the stormtroopers, approaching their position through the facility's corridors. He could feel their training, their discipline, their conviction that they served order against chaos. But he could also feel the doubts he had planted during previous encounters, the questions that had taken root in the spaces between orders and execution. "You do not have to do this," Xavier's thought touched 37 stormtroopers simultaneously, a gentle pressure rather than a command. "You could choose otherwise. You could refuse to kill in the name of an order that values your obedience more than your life." The effect was immediate and devastating. 12 stormtroopers hesitated, their weapons lowering fractionally, their steps faltering. 7 actively stopped, standing motionless in corridors as they grappled with sudden overwhelming doubt about their mission. 3 removed their helmets, tears streaming down faces that revealed youth and confusion. And the rest pushed through the doubt with gritted teeth and redoubled determination, angry at the intrusion, using that anger to fuel their advance. But 15 seconds of hesitation was enough. The rebel tech specialist completed the bypass. Xavier's chair hummed to life, and the strike team was moving, retreating through corridors filled with smoke and sparks, guided by a sliced security map that updated in real time as defensive positions shifted. The firefight intensified as they neared the facility's hangar level. Blaster bolts carved through the air in deadly patterns, deflecting off walls and armor in showers of sparks. Xavier felt each casualty like a hammer blow. Imperial and rebel alike. Lives extinguished for causes they believed justified the cost. A rebel fighter named Corrin went down with a bolt through his chest, his last thought a prayer to gods Xavier did not recognize. A stormtrooper named TK-7743 fell to return fire, his dying mind flashing through memories of his daughter's face. Xavier reached out desperately, not to control but to communicate, broadcasting a single thought to every mind in range. This does not have to continue. This violence serves only those who give the orders, not those who follow them. You can stop. The command center heard him. Moff Derek felt the thought penetrate his disciplined mind like an arrow through armor, and for one fractured instant, the Moff looked at the tactical displays, showing lives being spent, and wondered if Xavier was right, if the Empire's order was worth this cost, if there was any endpoint to the violence that would justify its perpetuation. The moment passed. Derek shook his head, reasserting control, and issued orders for heavy weapons deployment. But that instant of doubt rippled through the command structure, affecting decisions in ways subtle but significant. Response times slowed, coordination suffered, the machine stumbled. It was enough. The rebel strike team reached the hangar where a stolen Imperial shuttle waited, engines hot, pilot ready. Xavier was loaded aboard with the same urgent efficiency, the rebels forming a defensive perimeter as stormtroopers poured into the hangar's entrance. Blaster fire lit the space like a thunderstorm, bolt after bolt hammering against the shuttle's shields as it lifted off and accelerated toward the facility's open hangar doors. They cleared the facility with 3 meters to spare, the shuttle's shields flickering dangerously as turbo-laser fire from ground emplacements tracked their ascent. The pilot, a young human named Wedge, whose thoughts revealed combat experience far beyond his apparent age, wove through the incoming fire with a combination of skill and luck that Xavier found both impressive and terrifying. "Hyperspace in 30 seconds, Wedge called back. "Everyone hold on." The shuttle screamed through Scarif's atmosphere into the black of space, TIE fighters launching in pursuit, their distinctive howl audible even through the hull. The seconds stretched into subjective eternity as Wedge calculated jump coordinates and the fighters closed distance, their weapons charging. Xavier felt the pilots' minds, disciplined, focused, committed to their intercept mission, but also tired, bored with endless patrols, wondering if this particular pursuit was worth the risk of entering an asteroid field or engaging in combat with ships that might be better armed than standard rebel craft. The stars streaked into lines. The shuttle jumped to hyperspace. Silence filled the passenger compartment, broken only by labored breathing and the soft hum of the hyperdrive. The rebels began checking equipment and tending wounds, their thoughts shifting from combat intensity to exhausted relief. Hera moved to sit across from Xavier, removing her helmet to reveal a face marked by years of hard choices and harder losses. "Thank you for the assist back there," she said. "Whatever you did to those stormtroopers bought us the seconds we needed." "I showed them a choice," Xavier replied quietly. "Some took it, others did not, and people died because of what I did and what I failed to prevent." "People were already dying," Hera said. "That's what the Empire does. It grinds up lives and calls the result order. You didn't start this war, Professor, but you might help us end it." Xavier met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same exhaustion he had felt in Mon Mothma's thoughts. The weariness of fighting a battle that seemed endless, of making compromises that eroded the very ideals being defended, of carrying the weight of everyone who had died believing victory was possible. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. "Somewhere safe," Hera replied. "A rebel base where you can rest and decide your next move." "We're not the Empire, Professor. We won't hold you against your will, but we hope you'll see that what we're fighting for is worth supporting." "I have seen what you fight for," Xavier said. "I have also seen what you are willing to do in pursuit of that goal. The Empire believes its tyranny is justified by stability. You believe your violence is justified by freedom. Both of you abstract away the individual lives caught between your opposing certainties." "Then what would you have us do?" Hera asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice beneath the challenge. "Surrender? Accept the Empire's rule? Watch as more worlds are subjugated and more people are reduced to numbers in a bureaucratic machine? I would have you remember that means shape ends," Xavier said. "That the methods you employ in pursuit of freedom determine the kind of freedom you ultimately achieve. Violence breeds violence. Control breeds control. If you defeat the Empire by becoming like the Empire, what have you truly won? The chance to build something better afterward," Hera replied. "We're not perfect, Professor. We make mistakes. We sacrifice things we wish we didn't have to sacrifice. But we remember that we're doing this for something beyond ourselves. The Empire has forgotten that people are not resources. We haven't." Xavier wanted to argue, to point out the logical fallacy in her position, the ways that noble intentions had paved roads to atrocity throughout human history across countless worlds. But he also felt the sincerity in her thoughts, the genuine belief that guided her actions. Hera Syndulla was not a fanatic or a fool. She was someone trying to do the right thing in a galaxy where right and wrong had become hopelessly tangled. The hyperspace journey took 6 hours, plenty of time for Xavier to rest and for the rebels to tend their wounded. 2 fighters had been injured seriously enough to require Bacta treatment once they reached the base. Corrin's body had been left behind on Scarif, another casualty added to a war's mounting toll. The survivors processed their grief with the practiced efficiency of people who had lost comrades before and would likely lose more. Xavier spent the time reaching out with his telepathy, feeling the shape of the rebel network, through the minds of his rescuers. He sensed other cells scattered across the galaxy, small groups fighting in isolation or coordination as circumstances allowed. He felt the rebel leadership on various hidden bases, strategizing and arguing, united in their opposition to the Empire but divided on tactics and priorities. And he felt the ordinary people who supported the rebellion in secret. The clerk who passed information, the dock worker who looked the other way when rebel ships needed supplies, the academic who published coded messages in scholarly journals. It was a network built not on power but on conviction, fragile and resilient in equal measure. The Empire could destroy 100 rebel bases, and the rebellion would grow back like a plant from deep roots, nourished by the same injustices that justified imperial rule. It was a paradox Xavier recognized from his own experience. Oppression created resistance, and resistance justified further oppression, a cycle that spiraled until something broke catastrophically or both sides found a way to step outside the pattern. He wondered if this galaxy had the capacity for such transformation. In his own world, he had built bridges between mutants and humans, showing each side the humanity of the other, creating spaces where coexistence became possible. But that work had taken decades and was always threatened by extremists on both sides, those who preferred the clarity of conflict to the ambiguity of peace. Here, with the stakes so much larger and the wounds so much deeper, could such bridge building even begin? The shuttle dropped from hyperspace near a moon whose surface appeared unremarkable. Grey stone and ice, no atmosphere, no obvious signs of habitation. But as they approached, Xavier felt the presence of minds below, hundreds of them, a concentrated bubble of consciousness hidden beneath the surface. The base was underground, shielded from sensors and surveillance, a sanctuary carved from rock by people who had learned that survival required invisibility. They landed in a pressurized hangar, where medics waited to treat the wounded, and officers stood ready to debrief the strike team. Hera escorted Xavier through corridors that reminded him of the Chimera in their functionality, but differed in crucial ways. These walls bore murals and graffiti, messages of hope and defiance, the accumulated expressions of people who saw themselves as individuals rather than components. The difference was subtle, but profound. His destination was a meeting room where Mon Mothma waited alongside two other figures whose significance Xavier read immediately from their thoughts. The first was a man perhaps in his late 20s, human, with a kind of cocky confidence that suggested either remarkable skill or remarkable foolishness. Han Solo, a smuggler who had found himself drawn into the rebellion despite his better judgment, fighting not for ideology but for people he had come to care about. The second was a young woman barely 20 standard years old, with eyes that had seen too much and a bearing that suggested both fragility and steel. Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, a world that no longer existed, a survivor carrying the weight of billions of deaths. Leia's thoughts struck Xavier like a physical blow. He felt the trauma of Alderaan's destruction, the moment when she had watched her world die, the guilt of surviving when everyone she had known as a child had been vaporized in an instant. But he also felt her determination, the decision she had made to transform grief into purpose, to fight not for revenge but for a galaxy where such atrocities could never happen again. "Professor Xavier," Mon Mothma said, her voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone navigating complicated waters. "Welcome to Home One, such as it is. We are grateful for your survival and for the opportunity to speak with you under better circumstances than our previous meeting. Grateful enough to respect my stated desire not to be recruited?" Xavier asked mildly. "Grateful enough to hear what you have to say before making any demands," Mon Mothma replied. "You have demonstrated abilities that could change the nature of this conflict, but more importantly, you have demonstrated principles that many of us share. You refuse to become the Empire's weapon. We hope you will see that refusing to fight at all is simply another form of complicity." Xavier looked at each of them in turn, Mon Mothma with her politician's careful optimism, Han Solo with his skeptical pragmatism, Leia Organa with her burden of grief transformed into mission. They were asking him to make a choice, to commit to a side in a conflict that had been raging long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. But Charles Xavier had spent his life trying to find alternatives to the binary choices that others insisted were inevitable. And he would not abandon that principle now, even in a galaxy far from home, even facing leaders who genuinely believed their cause was just. "I will tell you what I told Grand Admiral Thrawn," Xavier said. "I will not be a weapon, not for the Empire, not for the Rebellion, not for anyone. What I will do is continue to acknowledge truth, to show people what they serve, what they have become, and what other possibilities exist. If that serves your goals, I cannot prevent it. But I will not be directed or controlled by your strategic objectives." "Even if that means the Empire wins?" Leia asked, and there was anger beneath her words, the fury of someone who had lost everything to Imperial power. "The Empire cannot win," Xavier replied gently. "Not permanently. Because the Empire's power rests on suppressing truth, and truth, once acknowledged, cannot be unseen. I am not refusing to fight, Princess. I am fighting in the way that serves the ultimate goal. Liberation not just of systems, but of minds and consciences." Han Solo snorted. "That's a fancy way of saying you're gonna sit this one out while people die." "I have never sat anything out," Xavier replied, and now there was steel in his voice. "I have spent my entire life fighting battles against hatred and fear. What you interpret as passivity is actually the most active form of resistance, refusing to accept the terms of conflict as they are presented, insisting on alternatives when everyone insists none exist." "Pretty words," Han said, "but the Empire doesn't care about alternatives. They care about control, and they won't stop until they've ground every bit of resistance into dust." "Then help me show their soldiers that they are more than dust," Xavier said. "Help me reach the ordinary people who serve the Empire not from conviction but from circumstance. Give me access to the minds trapped in the machine, and I will remind them that they have choices. That is worth more than any military victory you could achieve through violence." Silence settled over the room as the rebel leaders considered his words. Xavier could feel their thoughts churning, hope warring with skepticism, strategic calculation wrestling with moral philosophy. They had fought this war with blasters and starfighters, with sabotage and intelligence gathering, with everything they had. The idea of a different kind of warfare, one that operated through consciousness rather than destruction, was both appealing and deeply unsettling. Finally, Mon Mothma spoke. "What would you need from us?" "Transport," Xavier said. "Access to worlds where Imperial presence is strong. Protection while I work, but not direction. Let me go where I sense the most potential for change and trust that my methods, however unconventional, serve the same ultimate goal as your military operations." "That's a lot of trust to place in someone we just met," Han pointed out. "Trust is earned," Xavier agreed, "but it must also be offered. You freed me from Scarif at considerable risk and cost. That was an act of trust. I am asking for the opportunity to prove that trust was justified." Leia studied him with those haunted eyes, her thoughts a battlefield of grief and hope. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Give him what he needs," she said to Mon Mothma. "We've tried everything else. Maybe it's time to try something that doesn't end in more death." "More death is inevitable in war," Mon Mothma replied, but her tone suggested agreement rather than argument. "But perhaps the professor is right that we can reduce the total by changing how we fight." She turned back to Xavier. "You will have your transport and your protection. A small team, volunteers who understand the risk and the unconventional nature of the mission. In return, I ask only that you remember, every day the Empire continues is another day of suffering for millions. Your patience is admirable, Professor, but time is a luxury those under Imperial occupation do not have." "I understand," Xavier said quietly, "and I will work as quickly as conscience allows." The meeting concluded with logistical discussions that Xavier only partially followed, his attention divided between the conversation and the broader patterns of thought he could sense throughout the base. The rebels were tired, hopeful, desperate, and determined in shifting measures. They had scored victories and suffered defeats. They had lost friends and found new ones. And they carried the knowledge that everything they did might be futile, that the Empire's power might prove too vast to overcome through any means available to them. But they kept fighting. And that persistence, however costly, was itself a form of hope. Xavier was assigned quarters deep in the base, a small room with a bed, a desk, and a viewport that showed only the moon's barren surface. He sat in his chair looking out at that emptiness, feeling more alone than he had since arriving in this galaxy. His X-Men were gone, lost in whatever cosmic accident had brought him here. His school was beyond reach. Everything he had built over a lifetime of work existed only in memory now, and he had no way of knowing if he would ever return to it. But he was not without purpose. In this galaxy torn by war and tyranny, Charles Xavier still had his gifts and his principles. He could still reach minds. He could still acknowledge truth. He could still plant seeds of conscience in the spaces where fear and conditioning had taken root. It would have to be enough, because he had nothing else to offer except himself, and that had always been the only thing he truly had. The Force shuddered again, more powerfully this time, and across the galaxy a meditation was interrupted as Luke Skywalker opened his eyes from training with a gasp. The young Jedi felt something vast and incomprehensible brush against his consciousness, a presence that touched thought but was not the Force, that acknowledged him without demanding anything, that simply existed as a question posed to the universe. "Did you feel that?" Luke asked the apparition of Obi-Wan Kenobi that appeared before him. "I did," the Force Ghost replied, his translucent form flickering with unease. "A disturbance. But not of the dark side, something else entirely. Something that does not fit the prophecies or the patterns. The Force itself seems confused by it." "Should we be concerned?" Luke asked. Obi-Wan was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes distant. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "But I sense that whatever this presence is, it will force choices upon us all. Choices that may redefine what it means to be Jedi, to be Sith, to be anything in this changing galaxy." On Coruscant, in the Emperor's throne room, Palpatine opened his yellow eyes and smiled with something approaching delight. He had felt the disturbance as well, and where others might see threat, he saw opportunity. A new piece had entered the game, one that operated outside the rules he had spent decades learning to exploit. Such anomalies were dangerous, but danger, properly manipulated, could serve the Sith as well as any carefully laid plan. "Find him," the Emperor commanded his assembled Inquisitors. "This mind that touches thought, this consciousness that exists between light and dark. Find him and bring him before me, dead if necessary, alive if possible." The pieces were moving across the galactic board, drawn by gravitational forces toward a central point where Charles Xavier sat in a simple room on a hidden base, reaching out with his mind to touch a galaxy at war, wondering if one person's conscience could ever be enough to turn the tide of history. Time would tell. Time and the choices of 5,000 billion beings, each trapped in their own circumstances, each capable of more than they believed possible. The real battle had only just begun. Xavier's first mission began 3 days after his arrival at the rebel base, when intelligence reported unusual activity on Lothal, a mid-rim world recently liberated from the Empire's overt control but still struggling with the legacy of occupation. The planet's industrial capacity had been thoroughly exploited during years of imperial rule, its population reduced to labor force statistics, its native culture suppressed in favor of efficient resource extraction. Freedom had come suddenly when the Empire withdrew forces to concentrate on more strategic systems, leaving behind a power vacuum that local governments struggled to fill. The problem was not military. Lothal had no significant imperial presence anymore. The problem was psychological. 2 generations had grown up under occupation, learning to survive through compliance and self-suppression. Freedom, when it came, left many citizens confused about what to do with it. The structures of oppression had been internalized so deeply that removing the external enforcement did not automatically restore agency. Mon Mothma believed Xavier's abilities could help, not to impose a solution, but to help people recognize their own capacity for self-determination. The transport was a modified freighter called the Restoration, crewed by volunteers who understood they were embarking on an unprecedented mission. The pilot was Hera Syndulla, the Twi'lek who had led the Scarif extraction, her experience making her invaluable for the delicate work ahead. The security team consisted of 6 former soldiers, including one defector from the Imperial Army, whose thoughts revealed both guilt over his service and determination to make amends. And accompanying them was a protocol droid named C-3PO, whose linguistic capabilities and cultural database would prove essential in navigating Lothal's complex social dynamics. The journey through hyperspace gave Xavier time to prepare. He meditated, extending his telepathic awareness gradually, building his stamina for the work ahead. The neural dampeners on Scarif had weakened his abilities temporarily, and he needed to rebuild strength before attempting large-scale consciousness work. Hera observed him quietly during these sessions, her thoughts revealing both fascination and unease at watching someone exercise a power that seemed to violate fundamental boundaries of selfhood. "Does it hurt?" she asked during one rest period, finding Xavier in the common area nursing a cup of kaf. "The telepathy itself? No," Xavier replied. "But the awareness of others' pain certainly does. Imagine feeling not just your own emotions, but the cumulative emotional weight of everyone within your range. Joy is amplified, so is suffering. Learning to bear that without being overwhelmed is the first lesson every telepath must master." "And you've mastered it," Hera said, half question and half statement. "I have learned to function despite it," Xavier corrected. "True mastery would require becoming numb to others' pain, and I never want to achieve that. The moment I stop feeling the weight of consciousness is the moment I become dangerous." The Restoration emerged from hyperspace in Lothal's orbit to find a world healing slowly from industrial wounds. The planetary surface showed scars, strip mines that had been abandoned mid-operation, processing facilities slowly being reclaimed by native vegetation. Urban areas where imperial architecture dominated the skyline with its characteristically oppressive geometry. But there were signs of recovery too. Agricultural zones expanding beyond their wartime restrictions, new construction that reflected Lothal's traditional aesthetics, ships moving between surface and orbit in patterns that suggested commerce rather than military logistics. They landed at capital city's public spaceport, cleared customs with credentials identifying them as rebel liaisons conducting cultural assessment, and proceeded to lodgings arranged by local contacts. Xavier's chair attracted attention as they moved through streets that mixed imperial efficiency with native Lothal design. People stared, children pointed. Some citizens approached with curiosity, while others gave them wide berth. Xavier felt the planetary consciousness like a vast organism slowly waking from sedation. Confused, uncertain, afraid to fully believe the nightmare was over. Their contact was Governor Ryder Azadi, an older man whose face bore lines carved by imprisonment and loss. Azadi had been Lothal's leader before the Empire, imprisoned when he tried to resist Imperial resource demands, released only when the Empire withdrew. His thoughts revealed a mind still processing trauma while trying to serve constituents who looked to him for answers he did not have. "Professor Xavier," Azadi said as they met in his office, a former Imperial command center now repurposed for civilian governance. "The rebellion speaks highly of you. They say you can help people remember who they were before the Empire taught them to forget." "I can acknowledge what already exists," Xavier replied carefully, "but I cannot restore what has been lost. Your people have been shaped by years of oppression. Those experiences are real and cannot simply be erased. What I can do is help them recognize that their circumstances have changed, that the behaviors necessary for survival under occupation may no longer serve them in freedom." "Pretty words," Azadi said, echoing Han Solo's earlier skepticism. But what does that look like in practice? Xavier extended his telepathy outward from Azadi's office, touching the minds of citizens moving through capital city's streets. He sensed patterns immediately, people walking with shoulders hunched, eyes down, avoiding attention even though there were no stormtroopers to fear. Citizens falling silent when they passed buildings that had housed Imperial security offices, old reflexes triggering even though the offices were now empty. Workers reporting to former Imperial factories with the same resigned exhaustion they had felt under occupation, not recognizing that they could now question conditions or organize for better treatment. "I see people who have been trained to be invisible," Xavier said quietly, "who have learned that self-expression invites punishment, that community organizing leads to arrests, that hoping for better outcomes is a luxury they cannot afford. Those lessons are encoded deeply, Governor. Removing the Empire did not remove the Empire's psychological architecture. Can you help them unlearn it?" Azadi asked, and Xavier heard the desperation beneath the question. "I can remind them that they have choices," Xavier said, "but the work of rebuilding will take time and patience. This is not something that can be fixed with a single intervention. It requires sustained effort, community support, and most importantly, a vision of what Lothal can become now that it is free to determine its own path." Over the following days, Xavier established a pattern of work that would define his mission across the galaxy. Each morning, he positioned himself in capital city's central plaza, a public space that had once hosted Imperial propaganda rallies and was now being slowly reclaimed for community use. Reached out with his telepathy and simply acknowledged the people passing by. Not control, not command, simply recognition. "I see you," his mental touch said to a factory worker hurrying past with head down. "I see that you are afraid even though the fear no longer has its source. I see that you are more than your labor. I see you," he said to a mother pulling her child away from his chair. "I see your protective instinct, your fear that any attention might threaten your family, your exhaustion from carrying vigilance like armor. I see that you want rest. I see you," he said to a former collaborator whose thoughts revealed guilt and shame. "I see what you did to survive, and I see your struggle to forgive yourself. I see that you are human, with all the moral complexity that entails." The effect was gradual but unmistakable. People began to slow their pace when passing through the plaza. They made eye contact where before they had looked away. They began to speak to each other, tentative conversations that had been suppressed under occupation when any gathering might be interpreted as conspiracy. And slowly, over days and weeks, the plaza transformed from a space people hurried through into a space where community began to reconstitute itself. Xavier worked with intention and discipline, targeting specific psychological patterns he sensed in the collective consciousness. When he identified workers too conditioned to passivity, he touched their minds with reminders of their own agency, showing them memories of moments when they had made choices, however small. When he sensed parents teaching children to be fearful, he acknowledged their protective instinct while suggesting that teaching courage might now serve their children better. When he encountered former Imperial collaborators paralyzed by guilt, he did not absolve them, but showed them paths toward making amends through present action rather than remaining trapped in past mistakes. The work was exhausting. Each day left Xavier drained, his head aching from the sustained telepathic effort, his emotions raw from absorbing the collective pain of a traumatized population. Hera and her team protected him physically while he worked, their presence deterring the occasional agitator who objected to his presence or methods. But they could not protect him from the psychic cost of opening himself to so much suffering. On the 17th day, something shifted. Xavier felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, the collective consciousness of capital city reaching a critical threshold where individual changes accumulated into systemic transformation. People were speaking more freely. Workers were organizing informal committees to discuss factory conditions. Parents were allowing children to play in the streets again without constant surveillance. The city was remembering how to live rather than merely survive. Rider Azadi noticed the change in his daily reports. increases in civic participation, decreases in anxiety-related medical visits, subtle but measurable improvements in productivity and social cohesion. He visited Xavier in the plaza one afternoon, sitting on a bench nearby and watching the professor work with fascination and something approaching awe. "You're healing them," Azadi said when Xavier took a break to rest. "I am acknowledging them," Xavier corrected. "They are healing themselves. All I do is remove some of the barriers that prevented healing from beginning. The actual work of recovery belongs to them." "How long will it last?" Azadi asked. "When you leave, will they revert?" Xavier considered the question carefully, his telepathy reaching out to assess the durability of the changes he had facilitated. What he sensed gave him cautious optimism. The shifts in consciousness had begun to self-reinforce, people supporting each other's emergence from conditioned passivity, communities forming that would sustain the new patterns of behavior. "It will last if you nurture it," Xavier said. "What I have done is start a process, but processes require maintenance. You will need to establish structures that support self-determination rather than replicating the Empire's control through different means. Schools that teach critical thinking rather than obedience. Civic institutions that respond to citizens rather than dictate to them. Economic systems that distribute opportunity rather than concentrate it. In other words, do the difficult work of building an actual democracy," Azadi said with a tired smile. "Exactly," Xavier replied. "Freedom is not a destination. It is a practice that must be renewed constantly, or it atrophies into something else." The conversation was interrupted by a disturbance Xavier felt through his telepathy. Minds approaching the plaza with hostile intent, thoughts focused on violence and ideology. He had sensed these particular consciousness patterns before in his scanning of the city. Imperial loyalists, citizens who had benefited from occupation and resented its end, now organized into a group calling themselves the Restoration Committee, whose actual goal was to restore imperial rule rather than planetary recovery. There were 15 of them, armed with crude weapons and fury, moving toward the plaza with the intent to disrupt Xavier's work through violence. Their leader was a former overseer named Jorn Varric, whose thoughts revealed a mind that had found meaning in exercising power over others and could not adjust to a society where such power was no longer sanctioned. Xavier reached out to them before they entered the plaza, his telepathy touching their minds with precision refined through years of dealing with hostile telepaths and minds bent on violence. "I see what you have lost," his thought touched Varric. "I see that the Empire gave you status and authority that you lack now. I see your fear that without that structure, you are nothing. I see your anger at a galaxy that no longer values what you became." Varric stumbled, his aggressive march faltering as Xavier's acknowledgement struck past his anger to the insecurity beneath. The loyalists around him hesitated, feeling the same psychic touch, their thoughts suddenly exposed and seen in ways that robbed their violence of its certainty. "You believe force will restore what you have lost," Xavier continued, addressing them all now. "But what you have lost cannot be restored through violence or the reimposition of the Empire's order. You can only go forward, not back. The question is whether you will move forward with dignity or remain trapped in a past that no longer exists." "Get out of my head," Varric shouted, his voice carrying across the plaza, attracting attention from citizens and Hera's security team. "I am not in your head," Xavier replied, speaking aloud now so that others could hear. "I am merely acknowledging what is already there. You are angry and afraid. You feel diminished by freedom because you learn to measure your worth through dominance. But you are more than what the Empire made you. You have the capacity to become something better." "I was something," Varric shouted. "I had purpose. I mattered. And then the rebels destroyed everything and left us with nothing." "The Empire destroyed you first," Xavier said gently. "It turned you into an instrument of oppression and called that purpose. It gave you the illusion of mattering by allowing you to hurt others with impunity. What you miss is not the Empire itself. It is the simplicity of a world where your choices were made for you and your conscience could remain dormant. The confrontation could have escalated into violence. Varric's hand tightened on his weapon. His followers shifted their weight, preparing to attack. But in that moment, Xavier opened his telepathy fully, showing them not just their own thoughts, but the thoughts of everyone in the plaza. Citizens who were afraid of them, yes, but also citizens who pitied them, who recognized that loyalists like Varric were themselves victims of the Empire's psychological architecture, people who had been shaped into something monstrous and then abandoned when their usefulness ended. The weight of that collective awareness struck the loyalists like a physical force. They felt themselves seen not as threats but as tragic figures, people caught in circumstances they had not chosen and struggling with an identity crisis they lacked tools to process. And in that moment of being truly seen, their anger did not disappear, but it lost its absolute certainty. Varric lowered his weapon slowly, tears streaming down his face. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. And the question was plaintive, almost childlike. "Who am I supposed to be if I'm not what I was?" "That," Xavier said quietly, "is the question everyone on this world must answer. And it is terrifying because it requires you to make choices rather than follow orders. But it is also liberating, because those choices allow you to become someone you can respect, rather than someone who served a system that valued you only for your obedience." The confrontation ended not with violence, but with several loyalists sitting down in the plaza, overwhelmed by emotions they had suppressed for years. Hera's security team remained alert, but did not intervene, recognizing that what was unfolding was more effective than anything force could accomplish. Citizens watched with a mixture of confusion and wonder as their would-be attackers wept in public, barriers breaking that had held for years. Ryder Azadi approached Varric carefully. "I won't pretend what you did as an overseer was acceptable," the governor said. "People suffered because of your actions. But I also won't pretend you don't have a future if you choose to make different decisions now. We're building something new here. There's space in it for anyone willing to do the work of becoming better than they were." It was a small moment in a vast galaxy. 15 minds touched and changed, one plaza transformed from a space of transit into a space of community. But Xavier felt the ripples spreading outward through capital city's consciousness, the example affecting thousands of other citizens who were processing their own trauma and struggling with their own transitions from survival to agency. This was the work. This was what liberation looked like when it operated through minds rather than weapons. Slow, patient, profoundly demanding, but ultimately more sustainable than any victory achieved through force. Xavier remained on Lothal for 3 months, moving from capital city to other population centers, working with different communities facing different manifestations of the same core trauma. In mining towns, he helped workers recognize their right to organize and demand better conditions. In agricultural regions, he assisted farmers in reclaiming land that had been appropriated by imperial corporations. In urban centers, he facilitated dialogues between former collaborators and resistance members, helping both sides move past cycles of recrimination towards something approaching reconciliation. The work was never easy. Progress was non-linear, with breakthroughs followed by setbacks, moments of hope shadowed by regressions. Xavier faced hostility from citizens who saw his telepathy as another form of violation, resistance from power structures that had reconstituted themselves in freedom's wake, and the constant challenge of his own limitations. He was one person trying to facilitate healing for millions, and the scale was overwhelming. But he also witnessed transformations that vindicated his approach. A former collaborator named Morad Sumar, who had run a transport company that served the Empire, used his resources and connections to establish a cooperative that employed former factory workers at fair wages. A group of young people, who had grown up knowing only occupation, organized a cultural festival that revived Lothal's traditional arts and music. Ryder Azadi, working with Xavier's input, established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that allowed victims and perpetrators to confront their shared history without demanding either forgiveness or vengeance. These were small victories against the vast machinery of imperial trauma, but they were real. and they accumulated into patterns that suggested transformation was possible. As Xavier prepared to leave Lothal, Azadi asked him what would come next. "Other worlds," Xavier replied. Other populations struggling with the same questions. The Empire's control was never just military, it was psychological. Every system that achieves freedom will need to do the work Lothal is doing, rebuilding not just infrastructure, but consciousness itself. "And you'll facilitate that process everywhere?" Azadi asked, skepticism and hope mixing in his voice. "I will do what I can," Xavier said, "but I am one person, and the need is galactic in scale. What I hope is that the methods being developed here can be taught to others, that the work of consciousness restoration can become a movement rather than depending on any individual's abilities." "A movement of telepaths?" Azadi asked. "A movement of people committed to acknowledging truth and facilitating healing," Xavier replied. "Telepathy is simply a tool I happen to have. But the principles behind my work, deep listening, recognition of dignity, patience with process, to refusal to impose solutions, those principles can be practiced by anyone willing to do the difficult work of seeing others clearly." The restoration lifted off from Lothal, carrying Xavier and his team toward their next destination, a rim world called Jalukan, where reports indicated a different kind of crisis. A population that had embraced imperial rule enthusiastically, and now struggled with the cognitive dissonance of learning what their loyalty had served. Xavier watched Lothal recede through the viewport, feeling the planetary consciousness like a living thing, wounded but healing, fragile but resilient. And he felt something else, a disturbance in the force that he was learning to recognize even though he could not touch it directly. Something vast and ancient was watching him, had been watching since his arrival in this galaxy, waiting to see what role he would play in conflicts that had been building for millennia. The force shuddered, and Xavier shuddered with it, feeling the weight of destiny pressing against the boundaries of his consciousness. He was no longer simply a teacher trying to help traumatized people. He was becoming something this galaxy had not seen before. A bridge between consciousness and the Force, between individual choice and cosmic pattern, between the small personal work of healing and the vast impersonal forces that shaped galactic history. The question was whether that bridge would hold, or whether the weight of competing powers, empire, rebellion, force, and now his own gifts, would collapse it before his work was complete. Time would tell. Time, and the choices of beings who were only beginning to understand that choice itself was possible.